Chapter 1. The Bells of Marleycombe was the kind of village that postcards tried to capture, but never quite could. Its high street curved like a cat's tail, flanked by ivy-covered cottages, a tea-shop with lace curtains, and a butcher who still sharpened his knives on a whetstone by hand. At the heart of the village stood St. Luke's Church, its crooked spire rising above the rooftops like a watchful eye, and its weathered bell tower home to the melodic chimes that had marked every hour of village life for nearly 300 years. It was during one such chime, the 8:30 on a brisk spring morning, that something strange occurred. The bells did not ring. Mrs. Edith Tremaine was the first to notice. She was halfway through buttering her toast, marmalade jar open, cat asleep on the windowsill. At first, she thought it was her hearing. Again, she'd refused to get one of those new digital hearing aids and swore the older ones worked better. But no, she hadn't heard a sound. Not a single chime. Not even the familiar creak of the ropes from inside the tower. 10 minutes later, Miss Lydia Brent, the vicar's housekeeper, arrived at the church to find the door to the bell tower ajar. That was unusual in itself. John Bellamy, the church's bell ringer for the past 27 years, was fastidious about routine. Locked doors, oiled ropes, clean brass. He was nowhere in sight. By 9 o'clock, 3 people had already whispered to Miss Marple, who sat in the sunny corner of the Bluebird tea room, sipping her morning Darjeeling. The old lady nodded politely, folded her napkin, and stepped outside. By 10, the police had been called. They found nothing. Not in the bell tower, not around the church. No sign of John Bellamy. No blood, no struggle, no note. His bicycle was parked neatly outside, as it always was. His gloves hung on the brass hook, just inside the vestry. His thermos of tea, still warm. By noon, the whispers had turned into worry. "I don't like it," said Mrs. Hartley, the postmistress, to anyone who would listen. "You don't just vanish like that. Not John. Not in Marleycombe." "Maybe. He took a fall in the woods," offered Albert Fenwick, who ran the hardware shop. "Or wandered off and hit his head." "But he never missed a bell," muttered Lydia Brent, pale and wide-eyed. "Not once. Not in 27 years. Miss Marple, ever the picture of calm in her lavender cardigan and straw hat, merely watched, listened, noticed. She noticed, for example, that the vicar seemed unsettled, not grief-stricken, not panicked, just rattled. She noticed that Mrs. Tremaine had mentioned a visitor John had spoken to the night before, though she had been quick to dismiss it as nothing. She noticed that young Sally Winton, the grocer's daughter, had gone pale when she saw the police arrive. And she noticed something else, something no one else had mentioned. The chime mechanism had been reset, as if someone had tried to cover up the absence of ringing. By evening, a soft rain fell over Marleycombe. The bells remained silent, and Miss Marple, seated by the fireplace with her knitting, had already begun to suspect that this was no accident. No wander, no fall, no innocent disappearance. It was something else. Something far darker. Chapter 2. A village of whispers. Rain glazed the cobblestones of Marleycombe like spilled silver, giving the sleepy village an almost mournful look. The kind of weather that made people talk in hushed tones and draw their curtains earlier than usual. By morning, everyone knew John Bellamy had vanished. But in Marleycombe, nothing stayed quiet for long. "I heard he'd had words with the young vicar last week over that new hymn schedule," murmured Nora Chiswick at the greengrocer's. No, it was that new girl he'd been seeing. Fancy him, at his age. Said she was 20 years younger, hissed Margaret Browning as she handed over a pound of onions. "Poppycock," said Mr. Farnsworth, who ran the bar at the Hanged Man. "He went into the woods to pick mushrooms and got lost. I'll bet you anything." But no one believed that. Not really. At the edge of the village, in a small, neat cottage with white lace curtains and rose bushes that climbed up the stone wall. Miss Jane Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Colonel Melchett had phoned her that morning. A courtesy, he'd called it. The disappearance was still being treated as non-criminal, but the tone in his voice hinted otherwise. He didn't leave a note. Nothing disturbed, but something feels off. I thought you might keep your eyes open. Miss Marple had simply said, "Of course, dear Colonel." She had already begun to form a picture in her mind. Not a full one, but enough brushstrokes to suggest a figure standing where it shouldn't be, a silence where there should have been sound, and eyes always eyes watching from the shadows. That afternoon, she took a walk, Dot. It was the sort of thing she did often, and no one thought anything of it. But her eyes moved constantly, quietly, noting everything. Dot, she passed the Bellamy cottage first. Empty, the curtain still drawn. A flower pot knocked over on the step. A note pushed into the letterbox. A smear of something mud on the handle of the side gate. Dot, she continued to the church. A small crowd lingered by the lich gate. Lydia Brent was there, looking pale and overwrought. Dot, Miss Marple joined her gently. Dreadful weather, isn't it? Lydia nodded, eyes darting. It's the not knowing that gets to you. Did you see him yesterday morning? Lydia hesitated. Yes, he came early. Said he wanted to check the ropes before the Sunday ringing. He was in good spirits. Mentioned something about a visitor, actually. A visitor? Lydia looked down. Yes, a woman. Said she'd turned up the night before, unannounced. I assumed it was that girlfriend from Swindon. What's her name? Helen, maybe. But he didn't say. Miss Marple smiled softly. Thank you, dear. These little things help more than you know. As Lydia walked away, Miss Marple turned toward the bell tower. She stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything. The ropes hung in perfect stillness, but something on the floor caught her eye, barely visible in the gloom. A faint smear, reddish-brown, partly rubbed away. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she looked up. The narrow stone staircase to the tower rose into shadows. And Miss Marple, without haste, without drama, quietly began to climb. Chapter 3. The Tower and the Truth It Keeps. The staircase inside St. Luke's bell tower was steep, cold, and coiled tightly like a snail's shell. The worn stone steps bore the marks of centuries of footsteps, some light and prayerful, others hurried and heavy. Miss Marple ascended with quiet care, her gloved hand brushing the wall for balance. She'd climbed these steps before, many years ago, during a summer fete. But today they felt different, charged, like they were keeping a secret. The smell was the first thing she noticed. A sharp tang, metallic, like rust or blood. At the top, a narrow wooden door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple paused, not from fear, from caution. The wind moaned gently through the slit in the old stone, giving the room beyond a faint whistle, like the echo of a voice long gone. She pushed the door wider. Inside, the bell chamber was still. 4 heavy bronze bells loomed above, their ropes trailing down like the tendrils of some sleeping beast. Cobwebs draped the beams, and the single window was clouded with age and grime. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed. But Miss Marple's eyes were not looking for the obvious. She noted a scuff on the wooden floor, a mark from a boot that had pivoted. Sharply, she saw the narrow gap in the stone ledge beneath the far window, where a small black button lay, too modern for a bell ringer's coat. She stepped carefully toward the edge of the chamber. There, nestled between the beams and the old railing, was something dark. A piece of cloth, torn. And next to it, half hidden beneath the floorboards, something metallic. She knelt slowly, ignoring the protest in her knees. It was a broken chain, thin, gold, a woman's perhaps. A clasp had snapped Dot. She did not pick it up. She did not need to. Her mind was already beginning to form new connections. A visitor. A woman. A torn chain. A room with no escape, yet no man inside. She stood, dusted off her skirt, and slowly descended Dot at the bottom. Outside the tower, she nearly bumped into Sergeant Daniels, young, tall, with an air of someone who'd rather be in London than stuck in a village mystery. "Miss Marple," he said, politely. "You shouldn't be wandering around crime scenes." "I find a little walk helps the mind to settle," she said mildly. "And sometimes a fresh set of eyes sees what others don't." He gave a tight smile. No sign of foul play yet. Bellamy's still just a missing person. No body. No weapon, no proof. "But plenty of motive," Miss Marple replied softly. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" "Oh, yes," she said. "In villages like ours, you don't need enemies from the outside. All the danger you need is already here, quiet, patient, familiar." She stepped past him, back into the drizzle, and walked home, with slow purpose. Inside her parlor, she placed the kettle on the stove and opened a small notebook. She wrote 3 names: Helen, possible girlfriend; Lydia Brent; Vicar Hargreaves. Then she underlined a phrase at the bottom of the page. The bells did not ring, but someone silenced them. And just beneath that, she added another line, almost as an afterthought. Did the killer know what time the bells were meant to chime? She sat back as the kettle whistled. The answers were coming. Chapter 4. The woman from Swindon Rain lingered over Marleycombe the next day, like a house guest who had overstayed their welcome. The village green was empty, but for a few puddles, and a chill had crept in through every keyhole and doorframe. But that didn't stop the curiosity from spreading. At precisely 10 past 10, a cream-colored motor car pulled up outside the vicarage. It was not a village car. Everyone knew that at once. It was too clean, too sleek, and had too much Swindon about it. The woman who stepped out was striking, not in beauty, exactly, but in presence. She wore a scarlet coat and matching hat. Her heels clicked confidently on the cobbles, and her lipstick was the sort of red that made people nervous. Miss Marple, seated as usual in the Bluebird tea room with a scone and jam, watched with delicate interest as the woman approached the vicarage. Less than 5 minutes later, she was turned away politely but firmly by Lydia Brent, who had clearly not expected this guest. The woman did not leave. Instead, she walked straight across to the tea room. "Is this the only place for coffee in this village?" she asked aloud, scanning the room with eyes that missed very little. There was a pause. Then Nora Chiswick muttered, "There's a flask at the petrol station, if you like petrol with your cream." The woman smiled thinly, then spotted Miss Marple and made a beeline for the empty seat across from her. "Mind if I join you?" Miss Marple gestured gently. "Please." The woman extended a gloved hand. "Helen Larkin, I expect you've heard of me." "I expect you're John Bellamy's lady friend," Miss Marple replied softly, not unkindly. "Though I admit I expected someone different." Helen laughed sharp and short. "Yes, most people do. They hear bell ringer's girlfriend and picture a doormat in a wool dress. I run my own hair salon in Swindon. 2 chairs, 3 staff, and no time for nonsense." Miss Marple nodded. "You're brave to drive in weather like this. I didn't come for the scenery. I came because I haven't heard from John in 3 days. And now I find he's missing, and no one seems to be treating it seriously." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful smile. "Sometimes things appear quieter than they are. The police are looking, I assure you." Helen leaned in. "John called me Thursday night. Sounded odd. He said someone had come to see him, someone unexpected, and it had unsettled him." "Did he say who?" "No, he never got the chance." The line went dead, and when I rang back, he didn't answer. That's not like him. He always calls back. Miss Marple poured a fresh cup of tea. And did he seem frightened? Angry? Neither? Just tense, as if he'd remembered something unpleasant. At that, Miss Marple's fingers stilled for a moment. Helen glanced out the window, then stood. Well, I'm not leaving. I've taken a room at the White Hen, if the police aren't. Going to dig, I will. Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes, Miss Larkin, it isn't about digging. It's about listening. The truth tends to whisper, not shout. Helen raised a sculpted eyebrow. Let me know when it starts whispering loud enough. She left. In a sweep of red wool and perfume. Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly and looked down at her notes. Helen confirmed a Thursday night visitor. Was that the same visitor Lydia mentioned? If so, who were they? And what did they want? Outside, the church bell remained silent. But Miss Marple felt something shifting in the air, pattern forming slowly beneath the noise of gossip and the weight of secrets. Someone knew exactly why John Bellamy had vanished, and that someone might just have left a thread hanging. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Denials. The vicarage at Marleycombe was a solemn old house tucked behind hedges of holly and laurel. Its windows, tall and thin, looked like eyes that had forgotten how to blink. Miss Marple, escorted by the light clack of her walking cane and the faint creak of the gate, arrived just after midday. Reverend Hargreaves answered the door himself, still in his clerical collar, a woolen shawl slung around his shoulders. He was a man of upright bearing but nervous hands, which fiddled now with a brass button on his sleeve. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, sounding less pleased and more cornered. I wondered if I might have a word, she said kindly. I promise not to take up much of your time. He hesitated, then opened the door wider. Yes, come in. Lydia's out at the shop. The vicarage smelled of beeswax, paper, and something mustier beneath, a scent like damp hymnals or secrets long buried. Miss Marple was shown into his study, a room full of books and heavy wooden furniture that seemed to sag under the weight of scripture and silence. I assume this is about Mr. Bellamy? The Reverend asked, settling into a high-backed chair. Miss Marple nodded. It's a troubling business, isn't it? Hargreaves rubbed his temples. Deeply troubling. A good man. Punctual, respectful, private. Private indeed, miss, Marple said softly, though not without visitors. The vicar stiffened. Ah, you've spoken to Miss Larkin. Briefly. She mentioned a Thursday night phone call. Sighed. Mr. Bellamy sounded tense. That someone had paid him a visit. I wouldn't know about that, he said too quickly. Miss Marple regarded him with a look that, while pleasant, made most people feel slightly transparent. You hadn't heard? No, he said again, eyes shifting. That is, I may have heard something second-hand, but you know how things spiral. Indeed. But surely if a stranger had arrived in the village, you'd have heard something more concrete? His fingers tapped the armrest now. John was a solitary man, Miss Marple. Even I didn't know him terribly well outside of services. He never shared much, even when you argued last week. The tapping stopped. We didn't argue. No, a disagreement, that's all. He didn't approve of the change to the Easter program. I was adjusting the bell sequence for the sunrise service. Ah, a traditionalist. Stubbornly so. There was a pause. Miss Marple glanced at the wall, where a faded photograph of the church choir hung slightly askew. And would he have had reason, she said gently, to hide something? The vicar's jaw twitched. If he did, I wouldn't know it. He was loyal, quiet, not a man prone to drama. Miss Marple rose slowly, and yet something made him disappear between one chime and the next. She turned to the door. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been most kind." He followed her out, clearly relieved, but just as she stepped outside, he said too casually, "Do you think he's dead?" Miss Marple paused. "I think," she said without turning, "that whoever silenced the bells may have silenced him, too." And with that she departed, leading behind the vicar his unanswered questions, and the echo of truth he hadn't quite confessed. Back at her cottage, she opened her notebook once again. She drew 3 circles. John Bellamy, unknown visitor A. Disagreement over tradition. Then, in the middle, she wrote, "Who benefits from silence?" Outside, a bell did not ring, and somewhere in Marleycombe, someone was hoping it never would dot Chapter 6. The locked gate that evening. As the last traces of daylight faded behind the hills, Marleycombe slipped into one of those strange silences only a shaken village can know. No bells, no birds, no idle clink of teacups or clatter from the pub. Just a quietness thick enough to feel Dot, Miss Marple, wrapped in her wool shawl and carrying a small oil lamp, took the long path behind the church. She had always believed that truth lived in ordinary places, in hedgerows, garden paths, and half-forgotten shortcuts. Tonight she sought one in particular. There was an old gate behind the bell tower, mostly hidden by brambles, that opened onto an overgrown footpath once used by gravediggers and gardeners. Few remembered it, fewer used it. But Miss Marple did, and tonight it was locked. Dot, she held up her lamp. The chain was old, but freshly twisted. The padlock new, shiny, and out of place. Dot, curious Dot. She leaned closer, noticing faint indentations in the mud nearby. Boot prints, one set, medium size. No signs of struggle, just passage. And something else, crushed grass, and a torn fragment of cloth caught on a blackberry vine. Dot, she took the cloth between 2 fingers. Navy blue. Wool. Not weathered enough to have been there long. It matched the kind of coat she'd seen Sergeant Daniels wear. But what would a police sergeant be doing behind the bell tower at night? She pocketed the cloth. Dot, the next morning, she visited the churchwarden, Mr. Edgar Penworthy, a stooped man with thick spectacles and a voice that always seemed to be whispering a hymn, even when he wasn't speaking at all. Miss Marple. He greeted nervously. "Heard about the gate, have you?" "Only just," she replied cheerfully. "Seems odd, doesn't it? A new lock on such an old thing." "Oh, it wasn't me," he said quickly. "That gate hasn't been locked in years. Last used, I'd say, when the bishop came to inspect the tower, and that was, 2012? Yet someone felt it needed locking again." Penworthy hesitated. "Well, I did see someone near it the other night." "Who?" "Couldn't say." "Exactly. Was dark. Could have been the young sergeant, though I didn't think much of it. He said he was checking the perimeter." Miss Marple gave a soft nod. Very diligent of him. That afternoon she returned home and rang the police station. Sergeant Daniels answered. "Miss Marple," he said, "any developments from the amateur investigations?" "Oh, just thoughts," she replied sweetly. "Curious about that back gate behind St. Luke's." There was a pause. "What gate?" "The one with the new padlock." A longer pause now. "I don't know anything about that," he said flatly. She murmured. "Then someone else must be very determined to keep that gate closed." And she hung up. Her suspicion, once soft as fog, was beginning to take shape. Someone had locked that gate after John Bellamy vanished. Someone had hoped to delay discovery of something. But what? She turned to her notebook and made a new entry. Gate. Locked after disappearance. Fresh footprints. Possibly Daniels. Why lie about the gate? Then she circled one question. Was something moved through the gate? Or hidden? In Marleycombe, things had begun to shift. The silence was no longer passive. It was active, intentional. And Miss Marple was certain. The truth was no longer hiding. It was being hidden. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Rain. The rain returned that evening, soft but relentless, soaking the hedgerows and turning footpaths into ribbons of mud. But Miss Marple was not deterred by weather. She had lived through wars, scandals, and more than one murder. A little rain never stopped the truth. At dusk, she returned to the path behind the church, this time with a small umbrella and a pair of Wellington boots borrowed from her gardener. Her aim was simple: follow the prints. They had faded some since the night before, but not entirely. She moved carefully, eyes trained on the ground, and soon enough, just beyond the locked gate, she found a disturbance in the soil. Something had been dragged, not carried. The grass was flattened, the earth churned, and faint lines led deeper. Into the thicket beyond the churchyard. She followed. The path twisted through low trees and brambles. It was seldom used, an old servant's path that once connected the church to the vicarage orchard. Now it was barely recognizable. But 50 paces in, beneath a thicket of hawthorn, Miss Marple found something curious. A patch of earth that looked too disturbed. She bent down and pressed a gloved hand to the soil, looser than the rest. Recently dug. Her heart quickened. She returned with the police the next morning. It was Sergeant Daniels who led the search, face carefully neutral, though a muscle ticked in his jaw when she mentioned the broken foliage and boot marks again. Within the hour, the police had unearthed a canvas tarpaulin, soaked and rotting, wrapped around what was unmistakably a human body. John Bellamy, the quiet bell ringer, found in a shallow grave less than 100 yards from the church he loved. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the site as the officers worked. She said nothing. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply watched, her eyes taking in everything. The shape of the tarp, the knot on the rope, the small bruise on Bellamy's temple, and the absence of his left shoe. Sergeant Daniels turned to her. "Well, Miss Marple, I suppose it's murder after all." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she said quietly, "And the killer knew this path, knew how little it was used, knew the gate would keep people out." He frowned. "You're saying it was someone local?" "I'm saying it was someone very local. Someone who knew the timing of the bells, the gaps in patrols, and how long it would take before anyone noticed he was gone." She looked straight at Daniels. "And I believe you already suspected that, Sergeant. Why else would you have been there the very night after he vanished?" His face tightened. "That's a serious suggestion, Miss Marple." "Oh, not a suggestion. Just an observation. One I think the Colonel will be interested to hear." Daniels said nothing, but his silence spoke. Later at home, Miss Marple took her notebook once again and drew a final arrow. John Bellamy, found dead. Gate, locked from the inside. Sergeant Daniels lied about his presence near the site, and beneath it, in her tidy hand, she wrote, "The bell was silenced, but now the truth begins to ring." Chapter 8. The missing shoe, the discovery of John Bellamy's body, sent Marleycombe into a kind of stunned paralysis. Curtains stayed drawn. Children were kept indoors. Conversations in the bakery stopped entirely whenever anyone walked in. And yet, like always, the silence bred speculation. "He was found behind the church, you know," whispered Mrs. Tremaine to the butcher's wife, "wrapped up like a parcel, and without his left shoe. Isn't that strange? Perhaps it fell off," someone said. "No," said Miss Lydia Brent grimly. "It was removed." Miss Marple, meanwhile, was not content with whispers. She had already spoken with Colonel Milchett. The moment Bellamy's body was identified, she sent a quiet message requesting a private word. The Colonel arrived at her cottage that afternoon, a grave expression on his face. "Damned awful business," he said as he settled into the chair beside the fireplace. We've officially opened a murder investigation. Daniel says he'll oversee it personally, but you're not quite sure where his loyalties lie," Miss Marple finished gently. Melchett frowned. "You don't think he did it, do you?" "No," Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea. "I don't, but I believe he's covering for someone." Melchett raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is the next thread to pull." She handed him a list she'd written out. Body hidden behind locked gate Daniels. Found near site after disappearance chain found in tower. Possibly belonging to a woman Bellamy's missing shoe. Bruised temple. Possibly struck from behind. Who would have known Bellamy's routine so well? She asked aloud. Known he'd be alone that morning? Known which gate was still functioning and had the strength or motive to silence him? Melchett glanced at the list. The vicar? Miss Marple shook her head. He's a nervous man, yes, and hiding something ... but not a killer. No. I believe the key lies with the woman. Helen Larkin? No, the other one. Melchett blinked. There was another? Miss Marple leaned back. Lydia Brent mentioned a visitor one who came unannounced the night before Bellamy vanished. Helen assumed it was her being referred to, but Bellamy didn't call her until after the visitor had left, and he sounded unsettled. Melchett's voice was grave. So who was the visitor? I believe, Miss Marple said slowly, that it was someone from Bellamy's past. She stood and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down a slim, leather-bound church record. Years ago, she explained, John Bellamy was involved in a scandal. Not here, in Dorset. The details were buried, intentionally, but there was a young woman involved. He left the parish abruptly. I only know this because I happened to be visiting a cousin at the time and recall hearing the name. She handed the book to Melchett, open to a page with fading ink. John Bellamy, transferred from West Woodbury Parish. 1994. A woman from that village, Miss Marple continued, came to Marleycombe 2 days ago. I saw her. She stood across from a church just after dusk. I didn't recognize her then, but now I do. Melchett leaned forward. Who is she? Her name, Miss Marple said, is Margaret Nettle. She was once Margaret Bellamy. Melchett's eyes widened. His ex-wife? Miss Marple nodded. And I believe she brought that chain. I believe she climbed that tower. And I believe, she added softly, that whatever happened between them was not finished. The colonel sat back, stunned. Outside, the clouds gathered again. And inside, Miss Marple knew the next step was not simply to find the killer, but to uncover the truth that had been buried long before the body. Chapter 9. Margaret returns Margaret. Nettle did not return to Marleycombe quietly. She arrived the next morning in a rain-splashed taxi, wearing a green trench coat, a silk scarf knotted tight beneath her chin, and dark glasses despite the overcast sky. She paid the driver in silence and walked straight past the village green, where a pair of locals pretended not to stare. But of course they stared. Miss Marple was already waiting for her outside the White Hen Inn. Mrs. Nettle, she said, pleasantly, as if they were old acquaintances rather than opposing forces in a gathering storm. How nice to see you again after all these years. Margaret froze. Do I know you? You knew my cousin Emily in West Woodbury. We met briefly at a harvest fair. A flicker of recognition crossed Margaret's face. She gave a thin, guarded smile. Ah, yes, that was some time ago. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And yet the past never stays quite as far behind us as we'd like, does it? Margaret hesitated. Is there something you want? Just a conversation, Miss Marple said, and perhaps some honesty. They sat in the corner of the inn's dining room, which smelled faintly of damp wood and weak coffee. Miss Marple ordered tea. Margaret asked for brandy. I suppose you've already heard the news, Miss Marple began gently. About Mr. Bellamy. I have, Margaret said flatly. And I didn't kill him, if that's where this is going. No one said you did, Miss Marple replied, with a small smile. But it's strange, isn't it? You arrive in the village the night he disappears. No one sees you leave. You never come forward. And when his body is found, you return. Margaret looked down at her hands. I didn't come back to gloat, Miss Marple. I came because I had unfinished business with John. Not murder. Closure. What sort of closure? Margaret hesitated. Then, he owed me the truth. All those years ago, he made me out to be the unstable one. He left with his name clean and mine ruined. I thought I was over it. But when I found out he'd taken a post here, I wanted to look him in the eye and make him admit it. And did he? No, she whispered. He was defensive, cold, said I was digging up ghosts. I left him that night, and I didn't go back. Where did you go? To a guest house in Elmsworth. I stayed the night. I have the receipt. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I believe you. Margaret looked up, surprised. You do? Yes, because the person who killed John Bellamy didn't kill him in anger. They killed him with strategy. They knew the bell schedule. They knew when to act. And they had something to lose if a certain secret ever got out. Margaret blinked. So, if it wasn't me who? Miss Marple stood. That, Mrs. Nettle, is the question I intend to answer. She turned to go, then paused. By the way, she added gently, do you happen to own a gold chain? The kind with a delicate clasp? Margaret frowned. I did, years ago. John gave it to me on our wedding day. But it snapped clean in two. I left it behind when I moved out. Why? Miss Marple smiled softly. No reason. Only that I think someone else picked it up and used it to point blame in the wrong direction. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened her notebook again. She crossed out Margaret Nettle. Then she added a new name beneath it, Lydia Brent. And beside it, motive, devotion, or fear. Means, total access to vicarage, church, and tower opportunity. First to find, the tower door opened. And finally, beneath it all, was Lydia protecting the vicar or herself? The truth was circling closer now. And Miss Marple could feel the bells beginning to stir again. Chapter 10. Lydia at dusk. The sun broke through the clouds the next morning, but it brought no warmth. The village, still unsettled by the discovery of John Bellamy's body, remained in a kind of suspended unease. Curtains twitched, eyes followed. And yet no one said what they were all thinking. Someone among us is a killer. Miss Marple's thoughts, meanwhile, had turned more sharply toward Lydia Brent. There had always been something about Lydia careful, tidy, invisible. The kind of woman people barely noticed, unless she forgot the sugar or oversteeped the vicar's tea. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that it was precisely these quiet souls one must watch most closely. That evening, as shadows stretched across Marleycombe, Miss Marple made her way once more to the vicarage, this time not to speak to Reverend Hargreaves, but to Lydia herself. She found her in the back garden, clipping rose bushes with unnecessary force. Miss Marple, Lydia said, glancing up, her eyes slightly too bright. Is something wrong? Nothing at all, Miss Marple said, stepping carefully around a cluster of damp paving stones. I was hoping for a little company. I thought you might enjoy a walk. Lydia hesitated. Now? Yes, Miss Marple said kindly. It's always at dusk that the truth comes out. Haven't you noticed? They set off together down the lane, skirts brushing against long grasses, the air tinged with rosemary and wet bark. For a while they said nothing, until Miss Marple spoke. You were very loyal to Mr. Bellamy, she said gently. Lydia's hands tensed around her gloves. We worked closely, yes, but I wouldn't say loyal. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said. "I only asked because it was you who first told me he'd had a visitor. You who noticed he didn't ring the bells. You who suggested perhaps, too, quickly, that something had gone terribly wrong. I was worried, of course. And that's why you went to the bell tower the next morning?" Lydia stopped walking. I didn't go in. I just noticed the door. But you did go in. You said the ropes were untouched. The thermos warm. You saw too much for someone who merely glanced inside." Lydia's face went pale. Miss Marple continued gently. "You knew he was dead, Lydia. You knew before anyone else, because you found him. And because you helped move him." Lydia's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. "He must have called you," Miss Marple said, voice quiet. "Or perhaps you were already at the vicarage when the visitor arrived, Margaret. Maybe you overheard them arguing. Maybe John said too much. Or maybe he threatened the wrong person." "I didn't kill him," Lydia whispered. "I didn't." "Miss." Marple placed a hand on her arm. "But you knew who did." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes. "He was going to expose the vicar," she said finally. "He found something out about the money, the repairs, the donations. He said it would ruin the parish, ruin Reverend Hargreaves. And so the vicar struck him?" Lydia shook her head fiercely. No, he couldn't. He wouldn't. But I don't think it was an accident. I think they argued. I think John turned to leave and fell, hit his head, and the vicar panicked. And you helped him move the body?" She closed her eyes. "He begged me, said it would destroy the church. He said John was already dead. He said we just had to keep the parish whole." Miss Marple's voice was so soft, it was almost a breath. "And the shoe?" Lydia nodded. "It came off as we dragged him. I wanted to put it back, but he said it would only draw more attention. It was foolish." They stood in silence for a long while, dusk wrapping them like a veil. "I didn't kill him," Lydia whispered again. "But I suppose I buried the truth." "No, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You only hid it. But truth," she added, "has a terrible habit of digging itself back up." That night, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, *** Margaret, a red herring Lydia, the accomplice the vicar, the liar. But is he the killer? ***, and beneath it all, she added, the motive wasn't passion or revenge. It was protection. But who, truly, had the most to protect? Chapter 11. Tea with the vicar. The vicarage sat bathed in late morning light the next day, looking as peaceful as ever, ivy clinging to its warm stone walls, a cat sunning itself on the garden wall. But Miss Marple knew the difference between the appearance of calm and the presence of peace. She arrived just after 11, clutching a tin of shortbread biscuits. Reverend Hargreaves answered the door with his usual uneasy smile. "Miss Marple, how kind. Just thought I'd drop in," she said brightly. "A small gift. I find shortbread has a way of easing difficult conversations." The vicar blinked. "Difficult? I believe so," she said gently. "Shall we sit in the study?" They did. The same books lined the walls. The same old grandfather clock ticked with patient precision. But something about the room had changed. Perhaps it was the silence between words, or the way the vicar's eyes kept drifting toward the sideboard drawer. She poured the tea herself, uninvited. "You've always had a gift for public service, haven't you?" The vicar gave a tight smile. "I've tried to do right by the parish. And sometimes doing what's right is not quite the same as doing what's legal." Miss Marple said softly. He went still. "I know about the discretionary fund," she continued. "The missing receipts. The donations that never made it to the restoration account. Please, Reverend," she said kindly, "don't insult us both. Lydia already told me enough to begin the picture." He sighed and stared into his teacup. It wasn't theft, not in the way people think. I used some of the donations to help families in trouble, quietly, without bureaucracy. No one was supposed to know. And John Bellamy found out. Yes, I confided in him once. I thought he'd understand. But then he changed. Became sharp, distant, said the secrecy was dangerous. That it was wrong, even if it helped people. And when Margaret arrived, Miss Marple said gently, he must have feared she'd bring the rest of his past with her. And you feared. Exposure, too. The vicar's hands trembled. I didn't kill him. I swear it. But you argued. He nodded. Yes. He said he'd go to the bishop. Said I was risking the church's future. I told him to wait. To think. And then he turned. To leave. And he slipped. There was a lamp cord. I don't know how it happened. His head struck the stone. It was so fast. And Lydia helped you cover it up. I begged her. I panicked. I thought I could protect the church. I thought, if it looked like he'd vanished, there'd be no scandal. Miss Marple took a long sip of tea. You should have called for help. Told the truth. I know, he said, voice cracking. But truth is heavy, Miss Marple. It crushes things when it falls. She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood. I shall speak to Colonel Nelchett. You will turn yourself in. He nodded numbly. Will it matter? It always matters, she said. Even if the bells have stopped ringing, the truth must echo somewhere. That afternoon, as the police arrived at the vicarage, the villagers stood still, some in shock, others with a quiet sort of satisfaction. Lydia stood just behind the vicar on the steps, face pale but calm. And Miss Marple, from the garden gate, watched with something close to sadness. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply turned and walked away. Her notebook finally closed. Chapter 13. The Shoe That Didn't Fit. Village of Marleycombe settled into an uneasy rhythm after the vicar's arrest. Services were suspended. The bell tower remained locked, and a temporary clergyman was brought in from nearby Elmsworth. But Miss Marple wasn't ready to rest. There was still something that didn't quite sit right. It was the shoe. Not its absence, but its presence. Once found, Sergeant Daniels had retrieved it 3 days after the body was discovered. It had turned up neatly tucked beneath a hedge, not 20 feet from the gravesite. Too neat. Too placed. And when Miss Marple asked to see it, she found something else peculiar. She brought a magnifying lens, as she always did, and examined the inside lining. A size 10, she murmured. But Bellamy wore 9s. Daniels frowned. How would you know that? Because he told me so, years ago, when we were gathering clothing for the autumn charity auction. He was quite embarrassed at having such small feet. Daniels looked stunned. So this isn't his shoe? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, it's a plant. Someone placed it there to look like it had fallen off in a struggle. Someone wanted it to seem accidental, wanted it to feel hasty. But it wasn't. Daniels stepped back. But then, the vicar's story was incomplete at best, she said gently. Miss Marple returned home and reopened her notebook. Her suspicion, long curled in the corner of her mind like a cat at rest, had finally stretched and yawned. The shoe didn't fit, which meant the story didn't either. Later that evening, she paid another visit to the White Hen Inn. Helen Larkin was still there, still in her red coat, still watching the village through narrowed eyes, like a cat watching a mouse hole. I thought you'd gone, Miss Marple said softly. Helen smirked. Didn't see the point. Not yet. Did you know, Miss Marple said, that Bellamy's missing shoe wasn't his at all? Helen blinked. Excuse me? It was a size larger. Too large for him. Which begs the question, whose was it? And why was it planted there? Helen shifted. You're suggesting someone else was there? That night? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, that you were. Helen laughed once, dryly. What are you accusing me of now? Murder by footwear? Miss Marple didn't blink. I think you arrived that night after Margaret had gone. I think you saw John dead or dying. And I think you panicked. Helen's voice was suddenly sharp. Why would I panic? Because you had come to ask for money. Because you were desperate. Because if anyone knew you had been there when he died, they would assume you had something to do with it. Helen's hands trembled, ever so slightly. So you moved the body, hid it, planted the shoe, all to create a story of disappearance. That didn't point to you, and then you vanished before dawn. I didn't kill him, Helen hissed. No, Miss Marple said gently. But you moved him, which makes you a part of the crime, however much you wish you weren't. There was silence. Then Helen looked away, her voice cold. He was already dead. I just didn't want to be blamed. Yet in doing so, Miss Marple said, you made sure someone else would be. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple finally rewrote the diagram in her notebook. Vicar, accidental strike, then lied Lydia, helped cover it up Helen, moved. The body, planted the shoe Margaret, red herring, never returned. She underlined the final conclusion. A death by panic. A cover-up by fear. A deception by guilt. The truth was no longer hidden. It had simply been wearing the wrong shoe. Chapter 14. The bell tower reopens. It was a Thursday morning, ironically, the very same day of the week John Bellamy had vanished, when the bell tower was reopened. The police had finished their investigation. The body had been buried, and the townspeople stood gathered around the churchyard, like mourners of more than just a man. They were mourning peace, mourning simplicity, mourning the idea that evil lived. Elsewhere, Colonel Melchett stood beside Miss Marple as the large iron key turned in the tower door once more. A bleak business, he murmured. Necessary, she replied. It's only by reopening what was locked that we learn how to move forward. Inside, the air was musty and cold. Dust particles danced in the slant of morning light, and the bell ropes, once so carefully kept by Bellamy, hung motionless. Like forgotten vines. Miss Marple walked slowly to the center of the stone floor. Her eyes drifted up the walls to the wooden staircase. She stopped near the base and looked down. There, etched faintly into the floor, was a scuff barely visible, but telling. A heel, she murmured, pressed in panic. She turned, too. Melchett. He didn't fall at the vicarage, you know. Melchett frowned. What? He fell here? That's what Helen tried to disguise. She and Lydia both moved him separately, in fact, neither one knowing what the other had done. Melchett blinked. 2 cover-ups? Yes. Helen found him first, panicked, and dragged him out the back. Hid him. Thought she was protecting herself. Then Lydia came, realized he was gone, and thought someone had already discovered the death. So she created her own lie to protect the vicar. Dear God, Melchett muttered. Fear makes fools of all of us, Miss Marple said gently, and grief makes them liars. They stood quietly as the rope swayed slightly in the morning breeze. Later that day, the village held a small memorial. In the church. No hymns were sung, just the bell, rung once, solemn and low. Helen Larkin left town that evening. Lydia Brent resigned quietly from her post, though she continued to visit the grave every Sunday. The Reverend Hargreaves awaited formal charges, but was released on bail, the diocese taking over his duties. And Miss Marple? She returned to her cottage, sat with her tea, and opened her notebook one last time. She drew a final box around the word truth. Beneath it, she wrote, the bell ringer vanished. Not because he meant to, but because everyone else meant to forget. Would you like to continue with Chapter 15? You said, Colon, yes, Chat, GPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 15 of Miss Marple and Murder in the Vanishing Bell Ringer. Chapter 15. A visit from Margaret Marleycombe was quieter now, not peaceful. Not yet, but quieter in the way a shaken snow globe settles into stillness. The storm had passed. The flakes were falling again, but they would never quite land the same. Miss Marple was finishing her morning toast when the knock came. Not sharp or urgent measured, almost thoughtful. She opened the door and found Margaret Nettle standing there, a travel case at her side and her green trench coat speckled with raindrops. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," Margaret said softly. Miss Marple stepped aside. "I always answer when the person at the door comes carrying truth." They sat by the fire, Margaret clutching a teacup as if it were a lifeline. "I read about it in the Evening Gazette," she began, "that the vicar confessed that it was an accident, that the woman, Helen, was involved too." Miss Marple nodded. "A rather tangled affair, but yes. That's the shape of it." Margaret stared into the fire. "I don't know if I feel relief or guilt. I came here ready to confront him, but I didn't get the chance. And now he's gone." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence make room for the rest. Margaret continued, "When we were married, John had a temper. Never violent, just ... forceful. He liked things his way. The bells, the timing, the routines. But it was more than that. He had to be right." "I've known men like that," Miss Marple said gently. Margaret looked at her. "Do you think he changed?" "I think," Miss Marple said after a moment, "that he wanted to. But sometimes, when you bury something, shame, guilt, mistakes, it doesn't die. It waits, and when it rises again, it destroys everything. You've tried to build on top of it." Margaret exhaled, long and trembling. "I feel like part of this is mine to carry." "Guilt is heavy," Miss Marple said, "but it's not always yours to bear." There was a pause. Then Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a small item wrapped in tissue. "I found this when I packed my old boxes. I thought it was lost years ago." She unwrapped it and placed it on the table. A silver bell charm, on a delicate chain. John's wedding gift. Miss Marple looked at it with quiet reverence. The bell again. Margaret gave a sad smile. "Seems I can't escape them." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "it's not about escape. Perhaps it's about hearing them differently." Margaret nodded. "I think I'll stay one more day," she said. "Say goodbye properly." "You should," Miss Marple said. "Even those who vanished deserve to be seen in the end." That afternoon, the rain lifted. Margaret stood alone near John Bellamy's grave. No umbrella, no coat, just the silver bell charm in her hand, and the wind in her hair. Miss Marple watched from the path, unseen, then turned away and walked home. Chapter 16. The choir loft whisper. The following Sunday, Marleycombe gathered. Once again in St. Luke's Church, not for a service, but for something subtler, presence. Reverend Hargreaves was gone, Lydia too, but the people remained. The organ stood silent, the bells unused, but the pews filled with the soft creak of townsfolk coming to reclaim something. Miss Marple slipped into a side pew, unnoticed by most, as usual. She watched with a trained eye. Not for crime now, but for healing. After the brief reading and a moment of quiet, a sound broke the silence. Light footsteps in the choir loft. Heads turned. Then, from above, a single, uncertain voice began to sing. It was the youngest chorister, Thomas Cully, barely 13, who had insisted on coming back. His voice was thin, not quite on key, but brave. "Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide." People turned toward the sound, not with judgment, but with something like grace. And as he sang, a whisper began to build, not from the crowd, but from memory itself. Miss Marple felt it, not in words, but in resonance. A sense that something had come full circle. She let her eyes wander. The choir loft, the tower, the ropes, and then, quite suddenly, she noticed something peculiar dot above the loft, near the old brass plaque of donors. A section of the wooden frame appeared, lighter, recently scrubbed, as if something had been cleaned and hurriedly. She frowned. After the gathering, when most had dispersed, she quietly climbed the steps to the choir loft. Thomas had gone, but the light lingered through the stained glass. Golden and warm dot, Miss Marple ran her fingers across the pale wood, and then she saw it. A small scratch beside the beam. Not recent. Faint, but sharp. A letter. No 2 letters. HL. Her eyes widened. Not from shock, but from confirmation. Helen Larkin. Not the killer, but the one who had tried to remove all trace of her being there. She had knelt here, hidden, perhaps, while the vicar and John Bellamy argued down below. Perhaps she had heard it all. Perhaps she had seen the fall and done nothing, and afterward she had panicked, cleaned the place where she had been, left the initials by accident, or perhaps out of some bitter compulsion to mark her presence in a story she had no control over. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The murder had always been about protection, but the aftermath had been about shame. Helen, Lydia, the vicar, they hadn't conspired to kill, but each had tried to rewrite the scene afterward, and in doing so, they had twisted the truth almost beyond recognition. Later that day, Miss Marple sat in her garden with a fresh pot of tea and her open notebook. She didn't write anything. She simply turned to the final page, blank and waiting, and whispered to herself, "He rang the bells so we wouldn't forget the hour. Now the hour remembers him." Chapter 17. The sound beneath silence. The bells of St. Luke's remained silent still, but something in Marleycombe had begun to shift. The village no longer walked in shadows, at least not completely. There was warmth again in the bakery. Laughter at the greengrocer's. Even the pub had reopened its dartboard. But for Miss Marple, the silence held something deeper, a vibration not gone, merely paused. Like a bell not rung, but ready. She sat that morning by the window, rereading the letters she had gathered throughout the case. Notes from Lydia, copies of church records, a half-torn telegram from Margaret's past, and one still unopened. That had arrived from Helen Larkin just the day before. She opened it now. "Miss Marple, I've left for Bath. You won't see me again, which is likely for the best. I didn't kill John, but I knew things. I heard things. I cleaned them away. Does that make me guilty? Probably. But more than anything, I am tired. I hope Marleycombe forgets me, or at least forgives me." Miss Marple folded the letter neatly, then stood. She tied her scarf, slipped on her gloves, and took a short walk through the heart of the village. People greeted her with gentle nods, some still nervous around the woman who always seemed to know too much. But there was gratitude in their eyes. At the church gate. She paused. Then she stepped inside. The sun filtered in through the stained glass windows like soft music. The pews were dusted, the pulpit empty. But what drew her forward was the bell rope, untouched since the morning Bellamy had vanished. It swayed ever so slightly in the warm air. No hands touched it, and yet it moved. She reached up and gripped it. And then quietly, respectfully, she pulled. One note, low, full, echoing. It rang through the church, through the stones and wood and rafters, and into the streets of Marleycombe. Not loud, not alarming, just present. A sound to say, something ended here, and something else must begin. Miss Marple let go. Back at her cottage, she wrote one final entry in her notebook. Marleycombe, a place of quiet lies and louder truths. John Bellamy, a man of order, undone by chaos justice, rarely tidy, but always deserved. Then she closed the book for good. Chapter 18. Tea with the Colonel. It was 2 days after the bell had rung again when Colonel Melchett paid Miss Marple a visit. She saw him coming from the garden, his stride military, his brow slightly furrowed, as if still trying to arrange all the events in his mind like pieces on a map. She had tea ready, of course, and fresh lemon shortbread. "Well," he said, sitting down heavily in the chair across from her, "you've done it again, Miss Marple, though I can't for the life of me figure out how." "Oh, it wasn't so much done, Colonel," she said modestly. "It was simply listened to." "Listen to what?" "The village," she replied. "Its rhythms, its silences, its shifts." He gave a small chuckle. "You speak of villages as if they breathe." "Oh, they do. They breathe and mutter, and when disturbed, wince." Marleycombe winced the moment John Bellamy vanished. Melchett sipped his tea, nodding slowly. "You know, Daniels is rattled. He'd never admit it, of course. But the idea that 3 people lied to us in different ways for different reasons has made him rethink his so-called instincts." Miss Marple smiled. "It's rarely the act that surprises me, Colonel. It's the motives. Everyone thought the killer must have hated John Bellamy. But what truly doomed him was the people. Who cared?" The Colonel raised an eyebrow. "Careful, is it? That's a twist." "Indeed," she said. "Caring often leads to the worst sorts of lies." Lydia cared for the vicar's reputation. Helen cared for her own. And the vicar, I believe, truly cared for the community. Enough to forget that the truth always matters more than the protection of an image. Melchett leaned back, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "So what now?" "Well," she said gently, "Helen has vanished into her own silence. The vicar will face a tribunal, likely removed quietly from his position. Lydia? I think she's paid in guilt more than the courts ever could charge. And Bellamy? Miss." Marple looked out the window at the church tower, visible in the distance. "He will be remembered as many things. A man of routine, a man of order, perhaps even a man of stubbornness, but also one who rang the bells not just for worship, but as warning. He sensed something shifting beneath the surface, and he tried, in his way, to sound the alarm." "The Colonel nodded slowly. "Strange thing, though," he added. "After all this, I still can't say exactly when the murder occurred. The moment of it, I mean. It's like it never had a clear start. Just a slow falling apart." Miss Marple gave him a long look. "Most crimes," she said, "begin far earlier than we think. Not with the weapon or the blow, but with the first little lie. That evening, Marleycombe was still. But at precisely 6 o'clock, just as the sun began to slip behind the trees, a single bell rang out across the rooftops. And in cottages and shops, people paused. They did not shudder. They listened. Chapter 19. A letter in the pew. Monday morning brought an unexpected discovery. Mrs. Culpeper, the caretaker of St. Luke's, arrived early to dust the pews and polish the brass candle holders. She worked alone, humming tunelessly as she moved down the center aisle. But when she reached the 4th pew from the front, she paused. There, tucked beneath the seat cushion, was a folded sheet of pale blue paper. Not crumpled, placed, deliberate. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it, and what she read made her knees go weak. An hour later, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, the letter laid out carefully on her lap. Colonel Melchett stood nearby. Daniels just behind him, fidgeting. The handwriting was clear, looped, almost elegant. To whom it may concern. I have not had a proper night's sleep in 3 weeks. I see his face in the bells, in the ropes, in the stillness between the hours. I never meant to lie. I only meant to pause the truth until I was strong enough to face it. But the thing about silence is, it grows heavier with time. I loved him. Once, before I knew who he really was. And still, some part of me mourns him. Please forgive me. I am leaving Marleycombe. Miss Marple folded it with care. Lydia Brent, she said softly. Melchett nodded. The villagers said she left early this morning, on foot. No note left at the vicarage. Took very little with her. Daniels, still clutching his notebook, cleared his throat. Should we issue a search? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, let her go. But she admitted to hiding a body. She didn't run, Miss Marple interrupted. She released herself. There's a difference. Melchett watched her. Do you think she'll return? I think, Miss Marple said, that Marleycombe has taught her what it teaches everyone: eventually secrets aren't buried. They echo, and sometimes it takes distance to hear them clearly. That afternoon, the vicarage stood quiet. Shutters drawn, roses overgrown, and the church, though still silent, felt somehow lighter, as if the building itself had exhaled. Miss Marple, passing by, paused at the gate. She looked up at the bell tower. She imagined Lydia, climbing those steps alone the morning after John's death, seeing the empty space where he had stood for years, where he had wrung the hours into meaning. She imagined her fear, her grief, and her terrible, aching loyalty. Then she moved on. The dead do not need us to linger, but the living, they need us to understand. Chapter 20. The man in the photograph later that week. As Miss Marple sorted through a box of old village fate, programs and charity records, tidying up for the Historical Society, she came upon something she hadn't expected to find. A photograph. It was a faded black and white, edges curling from age. A group shot. Marleycombe bell ringers, circa 1939. Young men in their best Sunday coats, standing beneath the tower with pride. The bells had been silent during the war, but resumed just after . And in the back row stood a very young man with intense eyes and a crooked smile. John Bellamy. Only. Not just him. To his right stood another familiar face. Reverend Hargreaves. And beside him, even more startling, Helen Larkin. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. It had always been said that John Bellamy was new to Marleycombe, that he'd only arrived a few years ago, after decades moving from parish to parish. But this photo told a different story. He had begun here, and somehow come back. Why? She took the photo to Colonel Melchett. He studied it with a frown. This isn't the same Reverend Hargreaves, surely? It is, Miss Marple said. Only younger, much younger. Melchett raised an eyebrow. They've all known each other far longer than they admitted. Yes, which means John Bellamy didn't come to Marleycombe by chance. He came to finish something. She laid the photo down beside the blue-lettered confession Lydia had left. He had history here, she continued, not just with Lydia, but with Helen, with the vicar. Perhaps all three had once been close, perhaps even entangled. Something drove John away then, and something brought him back. Melchett leaned back, processing it all. You think? He returned to make things right. I think he returned to make things known, Miss Marple said. But some truths fester if left too long, and when disturbed, they don't heal, they erupt. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, the photograph propped on the WINDOWSILL. The truth, she realized, had never just been about one death. It had been about a return, not about unfinished pasts, and about how a single bell, rung at the wrong moment, could echo back through decades. The rope had been pulled by many hands, but the sound? That belonged to the village.